I have grown climbing beans for many years, but have only grown the bush versions of these vegetables for the past 2 years, and mostly in the polytunnel. The crop last year was not so good, mainly because I didn't know how they would grow in the sheltered climate, but the crop this season was much more successful, with much better results from the second variety trial. This has been really useful to select varieties that are more likely to do well in this context, and a successful trial like this has allowed me to better evaluate this crop in general, to determine if it's really worth growing bush beans and how they compare to alternatives. Last year was the first time I've grown bush beans, and instead of taking the sensible approach and starting small, I decided to conduct a fairly large trial involving 15 varieties of bush beans in one of the side beds of the large polytunnel. Unfortunately, I didn't expect the plants to grow so big, and to get so top-heavy in the calm and warm conditions that they fell over, which made harvesting much more difficult, which made it hard to properly compare the different varieties. A lot of the pods were not in great shape, and because all of the varieties were sown at the same time, they were all ready to pick at about the same time, which is better for the trial, but made the difficult task of harvesting much longer, and as a result I harvested less frequently. This year I sowed 10 of these same varieties in the other side bed of the polytunnel, and used a bent wire grid to support the plants, which was really successful. This kept the plants upright and in much better condition, and made harvesting a lot easier, so I harvested more frequently and was able to pick better quality beans, most of them when they were at their prime. I had also staggered the sowing of the different varieties, filling sections of the bed when the different early spring crops were finished. This is not so great in terms of comparing the different varieties, but it spread the harvests over a longer period of time without as much of a glut at any one harvest. It was a really successful crop, especially compared to the one last year, and I learned a lot about the different varieties and how these plants can grow. I direct sowed the 10 different varieties of bush beans after the spring crops over a 4-week period between the middle of April and mid-May. They grew well, despite some of them being overshadowed by the sweet corn in the next bed, and others having to deal with competition from courgette plants, and these different conditions would have affected the variety comparisons, of course. The harvesting began about 9 weeks after sowing and lasted for about 3 weeks for each variety, at least for the first wave or flush of beans the plants produced. With the staggered sowing of the different varieties, the harvest was extended over an 8-week period for all of the varieties from the last week of June to the middle of August, apart from the one variety that I left for harvesting when the seeds were fully grown but still fresh. These pods were harvested all at once about 14 weeks after sowing, and are not really comparable to the other varieties, but still useful to grow and delicious to eat. The harvesting of the pods from all the other varieties was still time-consuming, taking almost 15 minutes to pick 1 kilogram of beans, which is a lot more time than most other vegetables, but a kilogram of fresh, high-quality green beans like this is quite valuable. The yield, or kilograms per square meter, varied quite a bit between the varieties, with one variety being significantly better, but this one had a bit less competition from some of the courgette plants. This only counted the first wave of beans for most varieties, as I removed most of the plants after this first flush of beans was harvested, to make space for sowing salad crops. But even after this successful crop, I'm still not sure if it's worthwhile growing bush beans. They are, of course, a very high value and delicious crop, a vegetable that we like to eat a lot of. But they are also not so productive, especially compared to other types of vegetables that could have been growing in the same space instead, and other types of beans may be a better option. The yield from these plants was not great, even from the best variety, and the average of 1.7 kilograms per square meter is really quite low, with many other vegetables producing a much higher yield. And as much as I like beans, by growing them, they're taking up space that could have been used to grow another crop that we also really like. So there is an opportunity cost that I need to consider. These bush beans were a fairly quick crop in this context, with only 12 weeks from sowing to the end of harvest of the first flush. But this is still about 3 months occupying a fairly valuable growing space for at least part of the summer. So if I'm going to continue to grow bush beans in the polytunnel like this, then it becomes more important to select good varieties and to grow them in ways that I can get the most out of them. I could, of course, delay picking the pods a bit so that they will have a chance to grow bigger, which will increase the yield, but this will also produce pods that are not so tender, and I think it is nicer to get a slightly smaller yield of better quality beans. The other option is to leave the plants in the ground to produce another wave or flush of beans, and I had left 2 of the varieties which seemed to be producing quite a few additional flowers to continue to grow like this. It took another 8 weeks of growth before the second wave of beans were developed and harvested, with the plants getting quite a bit bushier with new growth. And this extra time more than doubled the yield, increasing the total harvest from both varieties to more than 4 kilograms per square meter. But the plants were in the ground from the middle of May to the beginning of October. This 20-week period occupying the bed could have been shortened a bit by starting the plants off in pots, but this would have taken more time and resources. At the end of July, I decided to sow 4 of the better performing varieties in another bed after the courgette plants were removed. This planting had a slightly more dense spacing of plants, and there was more space on both sides of the bed compared to the earlier plants that were squished up against the polytunnel plastic on one side. The plants seemed to grow differently, perhaps because of the lack of crowding or overshadowing, or perhaps because their initial growth happened in the warmth of the end of the summer, with the pods developing as the weather cooled down, which was the opposite of the first planting. And 2 of the varieties seem to be doing better with these conditions and are still strong plants this late in the season, while the others are struggling more, with some of the pods reducing in quality. There is still some left to harvest, but 2 varieties are already producing way more than the same varieties in the earlier planting, and another will probably catch up. But the 4th variety will likely end up with a lower harvest, mainly because the first planting of this variety produced a relatively high yield for some reason. It seems that some of these varieties produce better at different times of the year, which makes sense. And I suspect that all 4 of the varieties in the second planting would have produced significantly better if they were sown even a few weeks earlier. Overall, I am impressed with this later crop, which shows that bush beans can be a useful succession crop in the polytunnel, assuming they can be sown early enough. But the yield from these plants is only about 2.5 kilograms per square meter or less, which is still not great. While harvesting from the first planting of bush beans, I was also harvesting from the climbing beans, which were sown at about the same time in the same polytunnel. These climbing beans are the same species as the bush beans, just with vigorous growing vines that climb up twine tied to the polytunnel structure. And I was aware at the time that the harvests were a lot bigger from the climbing plants, many of which were easier to pick as I did not have to bend over so much. And by the end of the first flush or wave of beans, the better yielding 2 varieties of these climbing beans produced more than 3 times the yield of the best of the bush varieties. And the yield would have been even higher if I didn't leave a lot of the pods on the plants for seed saving. And I was surprised that they started producing beans only a week after the bush varieties did, with the first flush of pods maturing over a similar 3 to 4 week period. So the growth and harvesting periods of the bush and climbing beans were about the same, and I had assumed that one of the benefits of the bush beans is that they would produce beans a lot earlier. I didn't properly track the amount of pods produced later in the season by these climbing varieties, but it seemed substantially more than the 2 bush varieties that I had left growing a second flush of beans. The yield, or kilogram per square meter, is not a great comparison, as it does not really account for the overshadowing that would be caused by the taller plants, which would reappropriate some of the possible growth from adjacent plants. But even if I assume the climbing plants occupy twice the area, they are still substantially more productive than the bush beans, producing essentially the same quality of pods. So, climbing beans are a better crop in the polytunnel, assuming that they have support to climb and are not going to cause problems with overshadowing. We also grew a small batch of one of the varieties of bush beans in one of the gardens outside, sowing the seeds in pots and then covering the young transplants to protect them from the cold spring weather. These outside plants took a bit longer to start producing pods and had slower growth, but ended up producing a bigger crop of almost 5 kilograms per square meter over a 10-week period. And this was more of a continual harvest rather than the waves that were produced by the plants in the polytunnel. I didn't pay close enough attention to these plants to really understand what was going on, but they turned out to be a lot more successful than I thought they would be. And based on this one small crop, it probably makes more sense to grow bush beans outside, partially because I have lower expectations for how much plants should produce in the outside gardens, as the space is less valuable than in the polytunnels and there is more of it. But runner beans are so much more productive, with a crop in the same bed as the bush beans, producing about 14 kilograms of pods per square meter, starting later but quickly exceeding production of the bush bean neighbors. There are similar overshadowing issues with runner beans and the extra work of putting up a trellis or frame for them to climb. And they produce a different quality of bean that some people don't like as much, though others prefer. But if I want to grow a lot of beans, it's hard to compete with the productivity of runner bean plants in this maritime climate, but I will have to see what different varieties of bush beans can produce. So, as with many things, the answer to the question of whether it's worth growing bush beans really depends on the context. Of course, fresh green beans like this are a great crop to have, but there are more productive options. The bush beans seem to be a useful succession crop in the polytunnel, growing either before or after another crop that doesn't grow for the full season, and I'd be interested in trying to intercrop bush beans with other types of vegetables. It is easier to fit bush beans into different parts of the polytunnel, but they don't produce nearly as much as the climbing beans when the space is available. The bush bean plants growing in the outside gardens were more productive than I thought they would be, and I'm looking forward to trying different varieties for producing fresh pods, as well as for producing dried seeds for storing and use in the kitchen. Although the runner beans are a lot more productive outside in this climate, these bush and climbing beans, especially growing in the polytunnel, are more tender and popular, and given the choice, I would probably pick the bush or climbing beans over the runner beans to eat. So I'm interested in growing these bush beans more, and I will definitely be adding them to my planting plans in the future, though I suspect that they will always be a relatively minor crop, rather than a crop that I grow a huge amount of. And I was glad that I was able to grow a few really good crops of beans like this, to be able to better compare them, so that I can begin to better understand the benefits, issues, and limitations of a crop like this.